I wanted to show you an entire workflow, how we would go about method development, maybe to get good chromatography and detection of a molecule with accurate mass methodology. So at the moment I'm on a time of flight system, and first things I want to do is make sure the system is calibrated. So I have some reference solution, that's a log mass solution, or that's being infused in my secondary sprayer. I have a source configured, which is the dual Agilent jet stream source. But for now, I'm going to look at the system, do a tuning, and evaluate whether the system is giving the correct masses. I'm going to auto-scale these axes, put my tuning bottle on. The moment I do that, you'll see there's flushing of lines, and we should start seeing some reference ions. So the idea is we want to calibrate the system, and it will be stable for a number of days. We've always got the option that the calibrant is running in the background, but for now we want to make sure that these masses are within the specification so the instrument can run its own auto tuning. For now you can see 9220116 versus the 9220097, so maybe there's a slight deviation. So what we're going to do is do a quick mass calibration check in positive mode, and if we click this, it'll start its own mass calibration routine, rough calibration, and then also do a fine tuning of the calibration. What do we want out of a report? I've already got a PDF report open here. So what we want to see firstly is the corrected residuals. That means that how far out were some of the values, and once a polynomial correction is applied to all of these masses, how well it correlates. So you've got your corrected residuals, and compare these values 9220097 versus 0098, and that's what you want to see out of the reports. You can also see the time it takes for a particular ion to fly. For these small ions in the time of flight chamber, 118 takes 19 microseconds to fly through the chamber, whereas the larger ions, as the principles with time of flight take longer to fly, you can see these are 68 microseconds to fly through the chamber. Some other parameters you might want to evaluate on the day you maybe get handed an instrument are the vacuum and the rough vacuum conditions. These would also, let's say the system has been cleaned, these might take a while for the moisture to dissipate from the surfaces, and it's useful to keep an eye on those parameters. So at the moment you can see it's still tuning, and while that's happening I'm going to start creating a method. So I'm going to go to my control panel, launch an offline method editor, and from there on we can create different methods. I am analyzing a caffeine standard at 500 ppb. So I've already started playing around with different methods, and I'll show you what I have at the moment. So for my method 2, I am stepping through all of these tabs so you can understand how it's set up. For the properties, for the method estimated runtime, that gets updated once you finish creating the method. So we don't change much in this tab. For data analysis, data conversion, we might have sure mass conversion on or not, depending if you're doing screening for larger types of data files. In this case, it's not necessary. So no automations running data analysis wise after acquisition. That's what you would set here. For the multi-sampler, I'm doing 10 microliter injections with a standard wash. The wash I do want to increase to 10 microliters in the flush port, so that's going to be a pre-sample flush before and before the sample. So you can see that's dictated by a standard wash. I do have multi-wash configured on the system as well. There's no multi-sampler pre-treatment. Remember, this is where you can put in multiple programs, pre-column derivatization if required. At the moment I'm running my binary pump with mobile phases A2, B2, water methanol. We'll see what the chromatography looks like. This is my standard gradient setup, and I've got a 5-minute method. I'm using a 5 centimeter C18 sub 2 micron column. For the column compartment, 40 degrees combined, so that means the left and the right channel are the same temperature. For my diode array detector, I've got a number of wavelengths here for caffeine, where I have referencing on and referencing off. So I might want to increase this to span that range. There's 360, and remember what the reference wavelength does is it background subtracts immediately from this acquired wavelength. So if I go 360 to 290 effectively with that window, then I might have a good subtraction. And here I've also got some channels that are not background subtracted. Acquisition rate at 10 Hertz, UV lamp is on, and it's pre-balancing before the run starts. Then for the time of flight settings, remember the most important here are going to be the source conditions to desolvate that sample. And remember, when you're thinking about source conditions, think about your flow rate, 0.5 milliminute of a methanol. Methanol has a higher surface tension, maybe needs a little bit more temperatures versus things like acetonitrile where things ionize a little bit better. So I've got my gas temperature, that temperature in the front of the mass spec going over the capillary at 325. Drying gas flow, same story. The nebulizer dictates how wide the spray is at the nebulizer nozzle, and you can shape that by having higher flows and higher pressures. So at the moment 40 is fairly default. The sheath gas runs parallel to that alongside the nebulizer, and it creates that vortex desolvation. 300 is a good starting point with a good sheath gas flow. With a VCAP, remember that's the capillary voltage inside the mass spec, the first part of the vacuum, where we transfer charged analytes into the deeper parts of the mass spec. That's the voltage gradient. At the tip, it's 350 at 3500, and it's often measured in conjunction with the fragmentor voltage, which is at the back. How big of a voltage gradient is there? It's 3500, or going all the way to the fragmentor voltage, which is 150 at the back end. So typically we start with 3500, fragmentor 120, 150. If you have larger molecules, you might have to increase this to 4000, this to about 200 to have a larger voltage gradient, but you do risk fragmenting some molecules. Then you've got your nozzle voltage, which can create pseudo APCI-like conditions. If you have molecules that need APCI, you'd bump this value up to 2500, because that subtracts some of those ions at the tip of the nebulizer sprayer. Good, so those are some of the TOF parameters for acquisition. I'm running 3 spectra a second, and I've got my reference mass on, as mentioned previously. When I'm doing reference mass correction, I can decrease this window and also increase this abundance tolerance where the ions need to be found. So that's pretty much my method. I'm going to save that, and then we can start creating a method. You can see the calibration report, the tune report is finished. Again, what I'm looking for is calibration abundance, corrected residuals, and just eyeballing some of these values. So that seems quite standard. If I compare that to a previous report of earlier, you can see there's still fairly similar in terms of resolution for the system. Good. So we can then start our work list. So we will go save our tune, and then we can return to acquisition. You get asked to save the tune again just in case. And I will immediately start selecting my method 2 to start equilibrating the column in the right conditions. The TOF source conditions will also start heating up depending on where they are and where they were in the tune. We can start creating a work list. I'm going to create a new work list so you can see how it's done from scratch. So first things first, where do we want to save the data? Remember the data files. I start with the worklist run parameters, data file settings, and I'm going to save all my data in data, methods, test. Then for run parameters, I do not need synchronous data analysis or overlapped injections for now. And that's all we need to do in the worklist run parameters. I'm going to submit two samples, a blank in position 1, val 1, and this is where I select my method, method 2, and I'm going to give this a file name blank. It's going to inject 10 microliters as specified by the method. Then I'm going to add another sample. Remember, I can right click and say add sample. I can add multiple samples, and as sample positions I can select in my well plate, or I can actually select those 5 little positions in the at the auto sampler window that's not in a tray. So for my sample 2, this is my 500 parts per billion caffeine standard. That's prepared in water. And everything is green. My work list is created. So for now, I can acquire this and then we can look at the data. You'll see the reference mass bottle is not on. What you can do just to verify before you start the run is to get that reference mass bottle on. You'll see this flushing of the lines, and then you see this ion increase in intensity. And where do we want to see it? 922009798. It's bouncing around in that region, which it gives us a ability to eyeball some of these values before we start the acquisition. So I can hit play, and what will happen is it'll only start injecting once the system is ready. So we can return to these data files once they've collected, and we can evaluate whether we're detecting a good peak or not. So our work list is complete. Now we can have a quick look at those data files. So just scanning the TICs, we can see between the blank and my sample, yes, my blank has got a lot of background from the TIC, but there is a peak in my sample, just very quickly evaluating. In qualitative analysis, I'm going to open my data files. Remember, I put them in method test, and between my blank and my caffeine standard, I'm opening them at the same time. For my workflow, I'm using a target suspect screening bind by formula with a formula for my caffeine. You can already see between the two TIC there is a difference. So I'm in navigator view at the moment. I'm going to switch to compounds view, run this workflow, and see if I can find any of my compounds. Now the reason it's grayed out is because I was in navigator view and I was playing around with different spectra, so I just need to toggle that context again. So in terms of my files for my blank, of course, hopefully you haven't found any of your caffeine. There's no peaks, these are blank, there's no contamination on the system. For my sample itself, you can see we see a peak at 1.8389 minutes, and we can see different types of ions. In this case, we can see a protonated species and also some sodiated versions, the cleaned up spectra and the raw spectra as well. The other thing we need to evaluate is the peak shape. Here you can see some tailing, and there might be some benefits in adding the acid mobile phase acidic one versus just the unbuffered one. At the moment I'm getting a lot of background from my TIC as well. I could investigate that by using a range select tool double clicking and just getting a feeling for some of these high masses, what's floating around in the system. And it could be that the system needs a good flush and decontamination at this stage. If I go to my navigator view, I do want to see what the UV traces look like. There's a quick, easy way of doing that. You can go Actions, extract all non-MS chromatograms for both your blank and your caffeine standard. And what you can do is deselect. You can either sort these by data file, so whether you have the traces per data file being shown here, or you can search them by type. So at this stage, what I want to do is just have my chromatograms for the blank and my standard. So whether we're comparing the same thing, and I'm also going to take the TICs off. So at this stage, then I can compare either side by side and do some background subtracting. This is for my caffeine standard, and I can then also say subtract any chromatogram, and then you can see our peak of interest is there with some background coming from the blank, which is also being subtracted. So that's at 210 nanometers. At 280, we can see that again there's some contribution potentially from the solvent injection from a void, and then my peak of interest is there. Again, if we do subtract, then we can see the differences, which is definitely there's some sample contribution in the solvent contribution because of that large injection volume. So that's just very briefly how we evaluated. I didn't like the way the peak was tailing, and I'm now going to change my method, and I will show you how we do that. We go back to our method editor. We can either load up that method again, and then I'm going to immediately save as method 3 potentially, method 3, and I can also say acidic, as the method I will be selecting will then have water formic acid in that mobile phase. Now, the moment we select that, we should see a change here. If not, we apply. Then you can see that mobile phase changes to A1. And now you have to give it some time to equilibrate in the column. We can do that by either injecting 2 blanks in our sample of interest, or we can wait a few column volumes for that. I'm going to be lazy and just inject 2 blanks. I'm going to then add a duplicate blank, so I'm going to just create a replicate here. Blank 1, blank 2, caffeine standard. And now what I need to do is at least select my new method, and then I can also fill down or fill the column with my new method. So blank 1, blank 2, and here I'm going to say caffeine standard method 3. Great. That is then queued up for submission. The first blank injection we can really ignore because it's still the column is conditioning and changing over to our mobile phase. So we will return when we have some data. And that context was just, did I want to save the method? Yes, I did want to save that method. The only change I made was the, the radio button selection. The worklist run is completed, so now we can look at some of the data. So again, just glancing on the TIC, we can see there's our blank, and it doesn't look quite consistent because it was re-equilibration. You can even see the baseline has shifted. So let's have a look at those samples. We'll close these and then open the ones from the new method. So we can open the blank 2 and this one. Again, we can look at the data files. We can sort by data file type. There's a peak of interest. You can still see that TIC is quite noisy in the background. So let's run the method workflow, same formula. And we can see we found the compound at 1.8 minutes. Maybe there's still some tailing going on. and we might have different proportions of our sodiated adduct versus protonated adduct. If we go to compounds view, we can see some of the trace overlays. So just for that, we want to see what our ppm mass error is. Again, remember our interpretation of that. That's the overall isotopologues. Each one of these isotopologues, carbon-13, plus the monoisotopic mass. So you can get a breakdown of that in this little table, the compound identification results, where you've got the formula, you've got the monoisotopic mass, you've even got the protonated version. And here you can see it's the 195, 196. So monoisotopic mass, carbon-13 isotope, where we have two carbon-13 isotopes, and the individual ppm mass errors. And remember that score is the weighted average of those isotopologues. So overall, we've created a method, looked at some detection strategies for this, and from here on, I'm going to convert it into a sample purity workflow. So again, what I want to do is extract my non-MS chromatograms just to see what the UV traces look like. In this case, I'm just going to look at that one. So my UV trace, when I'm using referencing, I can see ever so slightly a peak. But if I'm going to do a UV purity analysis, I might have to consider injecting a more concentrated sample and then having a downstream splitter to the mass spec not to saturate the mass spec itself. So that's just a little bit on method creation, workflows, and managing a system. Hopefully you'll find that video useful, and please leave your comments on your experiences and your what else you want to see on a system like this.